Good morning. Open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Job, chapter 1. In April of 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in just a little over 2 hours, and thousands of people died. Still is the worst peacetime maritime disaster that has ever been experienced. It was a tragedy of such scope that many things changed that we still are blessed by in the transportation industry today. As far as there being a seat for every person on a lifeboat, clearly marked exits, and no favoritism based on your ticket price as far as how you could access that exit. But it was interesting when the wreck of the Titanic was finally discovered, because there had been speculation about exactly how was the ship wounded, exactly what was the damage done that would bring such a large ship down so quickly. And they expected to find a large, completely open gash. Instead, they found series of broken holes as it had scraped along the iceberg. Samples of the metal was brought back and studied, and it was discovered that the steel that the Titanic was made out of, there had been a flaw in the manufacturing of that steel, that it was more brittle than it should have been. Because what seems so reckless to us now, we forget in the historical context that other ships had hit icebergs, some head on and some glancing blows, and typically the steel would buckle or bend. But what they found along the side of the Titanic is the steel had shattered. That apparently the composition of the steel wasn't quite right, combined with the frigid cold water of that North Atlantic, caused it to be more brittle than it should have. It didn't buckle, it didn't bend, it shattered. When they're manufacturing steel, as they do with other materials, it's an alloy. It's not just one substance, it's iron mixed with other substances in small amounts to come up with just the right kind of mixture to give you the results that you want. But there are times when in alloys the material isn't quite right, or it doesn't come together quite right. And that need to get the combination of materials to bond together in the right way is the genesis of our word integrity. If it doesn't bond correctly, we say it doesn't have integrity, that it didn't come together with the composition that was wanted. We derive from that the application of what we call moral integrity. In our study last time, we looked at how Daniel, who lived as a godly, righteous man serving a pagan king in a land of oppression, still maintained his own integrity. Integrity is defined by the way you act, or it's illustrated perhaps, by the way you act when no one is looking. Because that's the real you. You're not trying to perform for an audience. It's also been said that integrity can also be seen in the way you treat people who have no ability to impact you. They can't help you, they can't hurt you. When you're around somebody that you realize could drop a favor on you that would really be powerful, we are sometimes really nice. Sometimes we're around people that we realize, oh wow, they could really harm us, and we're really nice. But what about people that can't affect you one way or the other? How do you treat them? These are two different ways that we might witness what integrity looks like. Without the proper kind of moral integrity, we will shatter in a time of crisis or pressure or collision. And the cost is tremendous. Job is described as a man of integrity. He's described in the first chapter in the opening verses. We learn that there was a man named Job, and that he was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. He's a good guy, a righteous man. In fact, he lives a life with a concern to always walk uprightly before God, that we learn in the first paragraph that even when his adult children would get together and they would have a feast together, that he would offer extra sacrifices. And it's interesting, the phrase, just in case, he says in verse 5, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. So Job went the extra mile even for his own family. Job does so well that he becomes a centerpiece of not just conversation, but of a witness to God's goodness. And in that conversation between God and Satan, God allows Satan to bring suffering into his world. God allows Satan to strike Job's life, and in a quick afternoon, Job loses everything. He's a man of great wealth and clout and influence, and he is stripped of his possessions, not just in the hundreds and thousands of animals and the wealth that represented, but the people that he worked with, the people that were in his extended tribe, they too lost their lives. And all of those relationships and all those families stripped from him, and eventually even his own children will be taken from him by calamity. In verse 20 of chapter 1, we read that as Job understands or begins to try to comprehend all of this news that's been delivered, he arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshiped. Worship is the word for adoration. Worship is the word for the expression of trust and submission in an incredibly difficult time. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God, which perhaps is the key idea in this book. Because as he was getting news, like in verse 16, in one of the calamities, while one messenger was speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. What did he say? The fire from who? The fire of God. The natural conclusion, the obvious truth was, God is wiping you out, when we know for a fact Satan is the one bringing evil. Now, it is true that God is allowing it, so all responsibility does fairly rest in God's hands, but evil doesn't come from God. The conversation between God and Satan continues in chapter 2 when God says, more or less, I told you, I've got confidence. It's an amazing thing to consider that God has confidence in the faithfulness of one of his servants, of a man. It says a lot about Job's faith and about his consistency. But Satan argues that, well, you haven't touched him personally. When you really get to his flesh, that's when you're going to see Job turn. And so God allows Satan to strike Job, and he is afflicted with terrible, painful things. The boils in verse 7 is described from the top of his head to the sole of his feet. I've never had boils, but I have had a sunburn when country redneck goes to Florida the first time in his life, sees the ocean, and decides he doesn't need a shirt, and so he plays in the water all day long. I can tell you about a sunburn from the top of my head, down my back, down my chest, both arms, both legs, and I can tell you the worst part is there's no place to get comfortable. Covered in water blisters, and went to Disneyland the next day and drew a lot of attention. Nowadays, I'd probably be arrested, I guess. But when I read this, from the top of his head to the sole of his feet, there's painful boils, which means he can't stand, he can't sit, he can't lay down. There's no place that he can adjust himself to find relief. In fact, he's hurting so bad that what feels good is to sit in the ashes of a burning dump ground and take broken pieces of pottery and scrape himself with that. And that's relief. And then one of the things that I don't understand, I still don't know, I don't know what's in her mind in verse 9. There are some who conclude that Job's wife was the worst person ever, and there are some that say, no, this is a statement of mercy, and I just don't know. But his wife sees him suffering such incredible discomfort and pain. And here's what she says, verse 9. Do you still hold fast your integrity? For Job, his faith and his practice is one and the same with who he is. That's integrity. The alloy is completely bonded, that his faith is who he is. What she's suggesting, it's time to break it apart. Because there are other people that live lives without integrity. There are other people whose faith is practiced separate or distanced from who they are. It's the kind of faith that might worship God and might sing songs on a Sunday morning, but then be dishonest in business the very next day. It's the kind of person that might post something about how God is good and how He's a blessing, and then uses words that are vulgar words and hateful words and dark words in the next post. That's a lack of integrity. That means that person's faith is never bonded with who they are. It's just something they practice. It is an activity. It's an event. It's not who they are. So what she's suggesting is it's time to break. It's time to separate. And it seems the implied idea is, why would you still hold fast? Why would you still let that be who you are when it hasn't worked out? It's obviously not been worth it. Look at all this. There isn't one single positive thing that anybody could look to and go, that's what makes it worth it. Not when you're sitting in a burning dump ground scraping yourself with broken pieces of pottery. And so she says, why are you still holding fast your integrity? Curse God and die. That's the very thing he was worried about his children. That's the very reason that he offered the extra sacrifices, is just in case that might have happened in one of his sons' heart. And now his wife says that of all things. Some have suggested that Job's wife has lost all faith and is like, it's not worth it. I don't know why you serve a God that hates you so much. Others have suggested that there's nothing like the pain you feel when the one you love is also in pain, because she's also grieving. It was also her children that were lost too. And maybe it's just one more thing she can't stand, and maybe she's saying, at least He'll put you out of your misery if you do this. I don't know. Man, I wish we had tone of voice right here. I'd like to hear her, and I'd like to see her say this. There is a hint, though, in a few chapters that it's not helpful. So when Job is tempted to do this very thing, here's what he says. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? Are we only going to serve God when He makes our day? Now translate that, because remember, a faith of integrity is a real, genuine, authentic relationship. It's not a religious activity. It is a relationship with one whom you love. So if I take that principle and apply it in another relational principle, shall you only stay married when it's going good? I don't know why that example popped in my head, do you? Are there not other relationships that we understand, that we're committed to, that are covenant? We say for better, for worse, for richer, or for poorer. Regardless, we're in this. That's integrity in a relationship. We're bonded, the two become one flesh, and we're not going to break apart. We're going to stick. We're bonded. That's integrity. Consider in our own lives the power of this statement. Shall we only accept from God what is good? What if what God has to hand us is something painful? And we know, because of the background of the first chapter, this isn't because God is mad at Job. It isn't because God is disappointed in Job. It isn't, and actually doesn't have much to do with Job. It's not because it's not transactional. Oh, you've done this, Job, so now I'm going to do this. There's something much different and much bigger that Job obviously cannot understand. So Job holds fast to his integrity in spite of his wife's temptation. And then he has three friends come. They come for the specific purpose. In verse 11 it says, they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. That's why they came. Well, that's good. That's what friends do. But when they get there, they see that his pain is so great that they weep and they tear their clothes. And then they sat with him for 7 days and no one says a word. 7 days. Nobody says anything. Finally, in chapter 3, Job begins to speak and basically begins to say, why was I ever born? I wish I had never been born. It's not that Job wants to take his own life, but he would have preferred that it had never been given life. He struggles with the depression that comes with such pain. And then to summarize his friend's help, in chapter 4, in verse 7, one of his friends simply says this, remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity or those who sow trouble, they harvest it. Now there's many, many more chapters of this conversation of Job's friend saying basically, wow, what did you do to deserve this? Brothers and sisters, suffering, adversity, hard times is much more complex than that. It is true, there are times when we will suffer the consequences of our own actions. If you jump off of the roof of the house, you just might bruise something. That's on you. And it is true that God may intervene, and suddenly there's a rose bush there you didn't remember that broke your fall and only gave you the pokies rather than something broken. In fact, it would probably shock us if we knew how many times God actually intervenes in our foolishness. But maybe He decides to allow us to endure the consequences of our own actions or choices. Well, okay. Maybe He intervenes and we don't endure the consequences. Okay. Maybe we have to endure the consequences of someone else's actions. We're devastated when an innocent family suffers because of the choice that someone might make to drink alcohol and then drive, lose control of their vehicle, and strike an innocent party. And it deeply troubles us. There are times when God allows you and I to have to endure the consequences of someone else's choice. And we all know many, many, many stories where people do get home who have been under some kind of influence, and we say, how did you ever make it home? Would that not be a case of God intervening more often than we realize? So there's times He does, and there's times that He doesn't. And there may be times that God allows suffering just because we're doing so well. The only one who understands why suffering is allowed the way it is God. Now, we like to make it simple. I like things to be black and white. I want to know 2 + 2 is 4. I want to know if you do this, this happens. That way, if I don't do this, then this won't happen. Did you know if you just eat your vegetables and take your vitamins, you'll never get sick and never develop a terrible disease? Don't we wish that were true? It's just not that simple to live here on planet Earth. Turn, if you would, to Job chapter 19. This conversation between Job and his friends goes on for a while. But Job says something here that has made me rethink, or at least notice something different in the closing verses of this book. Because I'd asked the question from the beginning, I don't know where his wife's coming from. I don't know for sure, and I hate to assign intent when I really can't tell. But this doesn't help. In Job 19, verse 13, as Job is expressing his pain, he says, He has removed my brothers far from me, and my acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have failed, and my intimate friends have forgotten me. Those who live in my house, my maids, consider me a stranger. I'm a foreigner in their sight. I call to my servant, but he doesn't answer. I have to implore him with my mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife. Let me just pause here. What does that mean? Y'all go ahead and smile. You know what's coming. One of the most interesting things about marriage, right, is all the discoveries of the whole person, right? You fall in love and they're amazing, and they are, and they still are. But then you start also finding some things you're like, I didn't know that. So imagine, this is hypothetical and has nothing to do with you and your spouse or mine. But imagine if you said to yourself, I believe I'm going to go smooch my spouse. But what if you had really terrible breath? Or what if you had just eaten something that they can't stand, and that's on your breath? And you go up to them and you initiate what's going to be an incredibly awesome romantic smooch. But what if your breath is laden with anything unpleasant? What happens next? Hypothetically, of folks that you've heard of far, far away. Well, what you'll notice is you have romance in mind, and what you get is rejection or withdrawal. You get the head pulled back and the eyes dilating. Whoa! Did you get run over by a garlic truck or what? What just happened? Right? That there is a withdrawal, there's a break, there's a disconnect. And it's interesting, that's how Job describes it, that my breath is offensive to my wife. It probably is, along with, he's got it with all these boils and stuff, he's probably smelling too. But his point is, when I try to get close to her, she's repelled, she's revulsed by me. Oh, sure, morning breath or something makes sense, but what about when you're hurting and you're feeling isolated, and the one that you are married to, that when you reach out to them, they push you away? It's a powerful and painful image. He says, I am loathsome to my own brothers. Even young children despise me. I rise up and they speak against me. All my associates abhor me, and those I love have turned against me. Man, you talk about isolation, loneliness. Nobody wants to help him with his pain, which he describes in verse 20 by saying, my bone clings to my skin and my flesh. I have escaped only by the skin of my teeth. Pity me, O you, my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does? So there's such loneliness and there's such pain. How does Job hold on to his integrity when he's completely by himself? So we talked about that integrity is how you act when no one is looking or when you're alone. He's alone. How do you do this? Look what he says in verse 23 as he begins to agonize. Oh, that my words were written, that they were inscribed in a book. That with an iron stylus and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. Now listen to verse 25. As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the last he will take his stand on the earth, even after my skin is destroyed. Yet from my flesh I shall see God. When he considers seeing God, is it an idea of terror or fear? Look at verse 27. Whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes will see, and not another. My heart faints within me. The thought of seeing his God makes him swoon with anticipation. Job's integrity comes from the relationship that he has built with God that isn't dependent on anyone else. It's affected by others, for sure. But it's something he has. Something that he has uniquely and has personally. Would you turn finally to the last chapter in the book? And this is what I hadn't thought about before, reading through this. Because while you're turning to Job chapter 42, Job had said there, we just read in chapter 19, that my brothers have left me, that my wife has left me, that even children are repulsed by me, that he describes being completely alone. And then there's an amazing conversation that Job has with God in chapter 40 and 41. And then in verse 42, or chapter 42, now Job says, before I have heard of you with my ears, but now I have seen you with my eyes. Job really knows God. Verse 10 of chapter 42. The Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord increased all that Job had twofold. Now look, here's the verse 11, that jumped off the page at me. See, everything's good now. Job's healed. His possessions are, he's rich again. He's got all kinds of, everything's going good. Verse 11, then all his brothers and all his sisters and all who had known him before came to him, and they ate bread with him in his house, and they consoled him, and they comforted him for all the adversities that the Lord had brought on him. Where were they? They weren't in the ashes with him. It's after he's healed and after he is restored, they come and they comfort him for all those mean things that God did to him. He's given more children. I'm assuming, because the text doesn't say anything else, that he's been given more children with the same wife, which means he also has his marriage restored. So I wonder. So it's a feast. It's a celebration. Lots of loud voices and lots of praise and smiles and hugs. And man, Job, it's good to have you back. So glad you made it. And whew, boy, I can't believe God did that to you. Was there a moment then or after that Job just quietly got his cup of coffee and walked out of the room and kind of eased over to maybe a rock under a tree or the bank of a stream? And did he ever just sit there and drink his coffee and think about when it was just him and God? When it was just him and God. When all the support and all the encouragement and all that was before and after, that none of it was during. What did it sound like when his brothers who had left him, what did it sound like when they comforted him? I never thought about that in the recovery, there would also be temptation. Because they blame God too. So what can we do this week to maintain our integrity? If the whole world notices or nobody knows or cares, let me suggest 4 things. First 2 from Ephesians chapter 4. Number 1, let us speak the truth in love. That requires integrity. We'll either shade the truth or we'll speak it without love. Paul says in Ephesians 4 to speak the truth in love. He also says in the same chapter, let no unwholesome word proceed out of your mouth, but only what gives grace to those who hear it. Regardless of who we're talking to or what we're talking about, may we speak the truth in love, and may we speak with words of grace. Thirdly, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Number 4, Matthew 22, Jesus says, love God with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your heart, and love your neighbors yourself. If we will do these things, regardless of our circumstances or our contexts, we will live lives of integrity. Consider this. If we jettison our integrity, how can God ever work in our life? If we hold fast our integrity, then God works powerfully through us for His purpose. This morning, if we can encourage you in your relationship with God, because it's you and God, we're here to help. But there are those in your life that will help you and those in your life that will hinder you, but it's you and God. But if we can assist you in getting to know Him, and that surrendering in faith and trust and being buried with Christ in the waters of baptism, but then walking together for years to come as God gives us time, may we be right here at Fairmont Park, right here in Midland, Texas, no matter what happens, may we always be people of integrity, that we would walk uprightly before God. We can encourage you this morning in any way. We invite you to come as together we stand and sing.